Well, Anthony Albanese at the weekend promised to slash the cost of buying a home for tens of thousands of Australians. Under a new policy for low-income earners, a Labor government would pay for up to 40% of a new house. Industry leaders have welcomed the announcement to help tackle the housing affordability and supply issue. Joining me live is the Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia, Ken Morrison. Ken, thanks so much for joining us. What do you think about
pleasure,
this?
Laura.
How will it work?
Well, look, we welcome the focus on housing affordability. You and I have spoken about this many times. We did some polling just before the election campaign and showed that 70% of people think that the great Australian dream of owning your own house is slipping away. So it's definitely right that we're focusing on this, and we do welcome the announcements yesterday from Anthony Albanese. There are actually two things put on the table. One was the Help to Buy scheme, which is a shared equity scheme for people with targeted incomes and targeted house prices. As you say, just 10,000 places a year. And this would enable people to buy a new property with the government being a co-investor in that property. So if it's an existing dwelling, it would be up to 30%. And if it's a newly constructed dwelling, it would be up to 40%. And the idea of that is it allows someone with a very low deposit to purchase a dwelling much earlier than they otherwise would have, because of the need to save for a much higher, larger deposit and for a much higher total house price. So look, because it's only 10,000 places, it's quite modest. It won't be distortionary in the market like an uncapped scheme would be. So we welcome that. But there's also some supply issues which were quite worthwhile as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would it work for these? It's up to 40,000 homes. How would it work? Would the government not only provide the deposit, or would they be paying a mortgage alongside the homeowners every month?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of detail which the opposition hasn't yet provided, but essentially these schemes would work that if someone satisfied their income requirements and the price limits for the dwelling that they were looking at, then they would apply to the government to receive one of the places on these schemes. Then, armed with that advice, they would then be able to go through and purchase, and they would purchase in a normal way. So they have to go and see a bank, get authorisation from the bank. They have to pay their stamp duty, pay the other transaction costs required. The bank would have to assess their ability to be good for the loan. But the difference is, instead of them purchasing 100% of the property, it would be them purchasing 70 or 60% of the property, depending on whether it was a new or existing dwelling. So a lot of process would be similar, with the additional requirement to first go and apply for one of these, and that's 10,000 places per year, so 40,000 over a 4-year period.
Okay, so this is great for, a fraction of those wanting to get into the market who are on a particularly low income. But it really doesn't do anything about massive supply issues and housing affordability long term. I mean, we need to be realistic, don't we? You can't do all that much about it. You do need to leave it up to the free market. And the honest point to be made here is those who do own their own home don't want to see the value of their properties go down. So, Ken, once again, we've spoken about this a lot. What is the silver bullet solution, if you like, if you can get as close to that as possible?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. This scheme and the government's very worthwhile home guarantee schemes, they're good schemes. They're targeted. They're for those who are participating in the schemes. They're helping people through those schemes. So, that's fine. But it's not systemic change. It's not addressing those fundamentals that have led us to this position. So one of the positives, the second announcement Labor made yesterday, was that they would set up a housing supply and affordability council, which would identify housing supply targets for states and territories, and also advise on best practice to overcome supply blockages. So, we think that is a good start, but really needs to have teeth if it's going to be effective. There need to be carrots and sticks to encourage and indeed ensure that there's consequences if states and territories don't meet those targets. I think it's only, as you say, that it's only if we're going to get this systemic response to housing supply that will address some of these housing pressures. And one of the things that we know is that the government's existing housing supply forecasts show that housing supply is set to drop by about a third just as our population growth returns to normal. So that's not where we want to be as a country. We don't want to see falling housing supply at the same time that demand for housing strengthens up. That's a bad spot to be for housing affordability.
Yeah.
So a good start from Labor on housing supply, but they really need to take it to the next level for it to be effective. So that's what we're calling on them to do.
Yeah, and with supply chains the way they are, the cost of building is up astronomically, more expensive, much more expensive than it has been in recent years. And you talk about changing the tax system around housing. Do you like the New South Wales government's proposal?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming you're referring to the land tax stamp duty swap.
That's right.
So look, the government hasn't yet landed on a final proposal here. In fact, there's a bit of a question mark about whether they'll actually take this through. The New South Wales budget's not too far away, so presumably we'll know at that point. Look, does have some merit to it. It's important that to recognise that stamp duty is a terrible tax. It does lock people into existing housing, so people are in homes that are too small, too big, bad for labour mobility. It's doing everything that a tax shouldn't do. It's impacting decisions in the market. So we know that, but what do you replace it with? So a low land tax on the family home could be a better option, but there will need some guarantees around it to make sure that governments are not ramping up that tax over time. We also want to make sure that business properties are not being overtaxed as they are in the ACT, where this scheme has been put in place. So we have said to the New South Wales government that we're supportive of this with some principles that would ensure that taxpayers are not going to get ripped off over time. But certainly if we can get rid of stamp duty, that would be a big positive for everybody.
Ken Morrison, we'll talk again soon. This conversation's certainly not over. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Lauren.